We're beginning Chapter 14, Central West African Vaccine Trials of Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, Nature, Accident, or Intentional. And we're beginning. The time had come to investigate the vaccine immunization studies conducted in Central West Africa during the 1970s, acknowledged that tainted hepatitis B vaccine was the prime suspect in transmitting the AIDS virus to homosexuals in New York. I now suspected the same was true for Central West African natives. By now, I also knew the major players in America's vaccine and cancer research effort were closely knit and well funded by the military medical industrial complex. Next, my task was to investigate the specific African vaccine studies and immunization campaigns waged by the human suspect, since this information might provide details on how AIDS viruses might have been accidentally or intentionally transmitted there as well. The United States Assistant for International Development Medlar search I had conducted days earlier provided numerous abstracts and references, among which were reported published by the International Association for Research of Cancer, IARC. Two International Association Research for Cancer abstracts, I immediately accessed detailed USAID support studies describing hepatitis B vaccine trials in Central Africa. One report acknowledged large-scale pilot studies carried out on children in order to test the safety and efficacy of Merck's hepatitis B vaccine. The report from Senegal stated, in 1978, it was suggested that hepatitis B vaccine should be used to prevent the early hepatitis B antigen HPBAG carrier state in children. Immunization was effected by 3 injections of hepatitis B vaccine at 1-month intervals, followed by a booster injection after 1 year. Children in a control group were immunized with DT polio vaccine according to the same schedule. In addition, an investigation was carried out on the immune response to hepatitis B antigens and tetanus toxoid. When administered simultaneously to hundreds more children in hepatitis B vaccine and DT polio vaccine, in Africa, immunization teams have a limited amount of time to devote to each rural community. These results demonstrated that 2 doses of 5 micrograms of hepatitis B vaccine are sufficient to obtain a high immunogenic effect in infants. The second abstract described another USAID hepatitis B vaccine study that was launched in Burundi, Zaire's eastern neighbor. A hospital setting was used this time to test new vaccines on infants. The abstract stated, vaccination against hepatitis B is carried out at birth in the Bujumbura Hospital in Burundi. The vaccination protocol comprises only 2 injections, the first being given during the first 48 hours after birth, and the second 2 months later. A booster is given at the age of 1 year. The results of this vaccination program are compared with those obtained in a control population. At the time of the booster, 82% of vaccinated subjects had anti-hepatitis B antibodies compared with 3% of control subjects. 6 months after second injection, all vaccinated subjects with anti-hepatitis B antibodies. So it was clear, hepatitis B vaccine studies, similar to those conducted in New York on gay volunteers, proceeded in Africa on children and infants during the same period. Moreover, some of these studies used various combinations of live and inactivated viruses to immunize the test subjects. This could have created additional mutant germs and unusual tropic diseases. The cream of international vaccine research. Next, I followed Krugman's paper trail to the World Health Organization office in Washington, D.C. Here on December 14th through 18th, 1970, The WHO held an international conference on the application of vaccines against viral, rickettsial, and bacterial diseases of man. Once again, the meeting was generously funded by Merck Sharp and Dohme. Pan American Health Organization, quartered in the WHO's Washington office building, co-hosted the event that made the world's cream of vaccine research rise to the occasion. Among the 330 researchers in attendance was Dr. Robert Maneker, Gallows Sr. at the National Institute of Health. Maneker, I learned from the proceedings report, had studied lymphoid leukemia virus at the National Cancer Institute. Gallows claimed to fame while Gallo was still studying to be a doctor at Jefferson Medical College. That was 1960, more than 10 years before Gallo allegedly discovered human T lymphocyte leukemia virus 1. I have to relook that. I want to know exactly what that abbreviation means. Pardon me. It's been good for both of us. So many abbreviations. Human T lymphocyte leukemia virus. Human T lymphocyte leukemia virus. And I lost my place. Great. Okay, here we go. Human T lymphocyte virus 1. That's what I'm going with that. That's it. Also in attendance was Dr. S. Paul Ehrlich Jr., representing the United States Department of Health, Education, and Wellness. Ehrlich later became the acting Surgeon General when Califano became Secretary of the Department in 1976. At the time, Congress was investigating the Department of Defense for its open-air biological weapons experiments on unsuspecting human subjects in San Francisco, New York, and elsewhere. Ehrlich's department then defended the Army by issuing a statement that read, "We do not know of any evidence that would indicate an association between the deaths reported in the press and the organisms reported to have been used in the atmospheric tests." Other famous researchers present were Hilary Koporowski and Stanley Poltkin. From the Wistar Institute, Dr. Albert Sabian from the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel, Hilleman from Merck, Purcell from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, and Krugman from the New York University Medical Center. Hilleman and Krugman were acknowledged for working on the 10-member program committee, and Hilleman was given special credit for being a consultant to the organization. The most well-represented organizations at the conference included Merck, who had sent a total of 10 delegates, the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, the United States Department of the Army in Washington, and the Biological Defense Research Center in Fort Detrick, and the Navy Department in Washington. The Behringwerk AG in Marburg-Lahn, the Paul Ehrlich Institute in Frankfurt, Maine, and the Institute of Immunology, Sera and Vaccines in Zagreb, Yugoslavia, were also well represented. These three research centers were where, in 1976, the Marburg virus outbreak occurred. Other organizations represented included the United States Assistant for International Development, and the CDC and the NIH, or the National Institute of Health. 20 countries Central West African experiments. The conference highlights included several presentations and discussions about numerous vaccine trials conducted specifically in Central West Africa. The researchers discussed testing vaccines against the myriad ailments for which Merck and the others maintained huge financial interests. Vaccines, the presenter noted, had been developed for yellow fever, measles, mumps, poliomyelitis, smallpox, diphtheria, pertussis, tinnitus, and rubella. Central West African natives were largely the subjects of the researchers' experiments. Dr. William Fogate from the CDC described the breadth of initial United States assistance for international development and the Centers of Disease Control vaccine trials in the region. Although measles vaccinations in Africa was his topic, his discussion included smallpox. Fogate reported that in 1961, recognizing the public health significance of measles, the government of Upper Volta conducted an immunization trial. Because of its success, in 1963 the government conducted a nationwide immunization program with assistance from the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Projects were soon started in other countries, and by 1966, 11 West African countries were engaged in such programs. Early in 1976, measles immunization programs were started as a part of coordinated 20-country regional program for smallpox eradication and measles control. Just had a blackout. Good thing we got a generator. Program for smallpox eradication and measles control with technical assistance from USAID and the U.S. Center for Disease Control. The original objective in regard to measles was stated to be control rather than eradication. The methods to be employed consisted of village-by-village programs carried out by mobile teams using jet injectors. Children from 6 months to 6 years of age were to be immunized during the first cycle. The upper age limit for subsequent cycles would be 6 months plus the interval since the previous cycle. Fogate's statement and article was particularly interesting for 3 reasons. First, he cited many of the 20 countries that had participated in the Central West African vaccine trials. This I felt was suspicious evidence. As Schultz wrote in The Band, the spread of AIDS in Africa most likely outpaced the spread in any other region in the world. 1 in 6 European AIDS patients was African. These cases could be traced to 18 sub-Saharan African nations. 2/3 of the African-linked AIDS cases in Europe, however, came from one country, Zaire, and 11% came from the nearby Congo. In Zaire, the virus was so widespread that scientists had a hard time constructing studies on risk factors. It was difficult to find a control group that was not infected, and despite this epidemiologic evidence that the disease had followed a specific path previously worn by multi-component vaccine trials, Belgian scientists reported only one major risk factor in the victim nations: heterosexual promiscuity. My thoughts diverted to the few scientists who voiced concern about this arbitrary conclusion. The CDC Merck rebuttal to hepatitis B vaccine suspicions was insufficient at best and at worst scientific fraud. Why, after all, were the New York City AIDS cases spared from hepatitis B vaccine analysis? Why had the scientific community not acknowledged their flawed study design? The only educated guess I could render was that anyone in the international scientific community even remotely depended on grants from the National Institute of Health, United States Public Health Services, Center of Disease Control, National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, United States Assistance for International Development, and the World Health Organization, or pharmaceutical industry contracts wouldn't dare object. To buck the system in this way would be like committing academic and economic suicide for anyone dependent on the establishment for their livelihood. And that was almost everyone with the wherewithal to evaluate the hard facts. Before I start that, here's the combined measles smallpox immunization campaign by agencies suspected of spreading AIDS to Central and West Africa. Graph depicts cumulative measles smallpox immunization in the estimated target population of 20 to 22 million West and Central African natives from 20 countries. That is so straight up. Okay. Second, Foga's paper documented the extent to which the African smallpox eradication campaign was used to test other experimental vaccines that would eventually be licensed by Merck. This was important because, one, according to comments by Hilleman, Merck ended up owning the licensing rights to various vaccines, even though federally funded. Investigators did the lion's share of the primary research. That's how it always is. The American taxpayer foots the bill, and the company says, "Oh, this is what I created on my own wherewithal and charges a premium." Of course. And two, as was documented when Gallo acknowledged the National Cancer Institute's drug development branch for relaying Merck's experimental reagent cordyceps, there was obviously a channel from Merck to the National Cancer Institute, and therefore from Africa to the United States, through which experimental drugs and immune system impacting biologicals like vaccines flowed. And three, these African multiviral vaccine tests were clearly dangerous. As numerous scientists had shown, the AIDS virus appeared to contain several recognizable components from other viruses. This, according to Strecker, strongly suggested that AIDS was constructed. Therefore, vaccine experiments in which particles from different types of viruses were combined in humans, animals, or cell cultures provided a plausible explanation for new emerging viruses from this region of the world. Strecker's theory of man-made HIV development from bovine and Visna viruses, however, failed to consider one important fact. The principal National Cancer Institute viral researchers implicated by the scientific evidence were not experimenting with sheep or cow lentiviruses in Manhattan in the early 1970s. They were experimenting with various primate cancer viruses and vaccines. Moreover, Russian researchers were not implicated whatsoever by the paper trail. The spotlight of suspicion focused primarily on Merck, Gallo, and at the National Cancer Institute and Littleton Bionetics and their New York colleagues. Figure 14.2, map of Africa and the sub-Saharan nations hardest hit by the AIDS epidemic. Map of Africa shows the nations in Central Africa hardest hit by the AIDS epidemic were those in which experimental vaccines were administered. This work was supported by the United States Assistance for International Development, the Centers of Disease Control, and the World Health Organization, Merck and Company Incorporated, and the National Cancer Institute. Source: Lederer R. Origin Spread of AIDS. Is the West responsible? Covert Action Information Bulletin, 1978, 28:43. Experimental vaccines, huh? What are they doing now? The heart of the military medical industrial complex. Within minutes of Foga's presentation, Saul Krugman stood up and reported that in Africa and elsewhere, their measles vaccine studies had been supported by the Health Research Council of the City of New York and his organization, the New York University Medical Center, who was behind the Health Research Council of the City of New York. I wondered, why were they interested in vaccinating black Africans overseas? Hilleman had openly admitted that his group at Merck followed Krugman's lead in developing the hepatitis B vaccine. This was evidence to support the theory that the African AIDS Party began in New York and was hosted by key players in America's military medical industrial complex. Besides the Army, Krugman credited Merck and Dow Chemical Company, both Army weapons contractors, for the vaccines used in his trials. That was okay. Yeah. On reviewing the Army's list of principal biological weapons contractors once again, I realized Dow Chemical had just topped Hazleton Laboratories a few $1,000s and was closing ground on Bionetics Research Laboratories, which held 6th place. In 4th place was the University of Chicago, where Gallo interned and began to publish his blood cancer research. Stanford University, where Gallo had sent his cell cultures to have them examined for bacterial and fungal contamination, was in 13th place, and last on the list was New England Nuclear Corporation. Then I realized that Gallo documented receiving support from at least a third of the Army's top 18 biological research contractors, including Bionetics, Hazelton, the University of Chicago, Stanford University, Dow Chemical, and New England Nuclear Corporation, not including his documented connection to Krugman's staff at the New York University Medical Center or Hilliman's colleagues at Merck. Objections and predictions for unnatural disaster. I sat glued reviewing discourses between several conference participants, including Merck's Hilliman, Dr. Frederick Rasmussen, Dr. Frederick Rasmussen, Jr., of the University of California School of Medicine, another certified bioweapons contractor with links to Gallo and immunosuppressive germ warfare, Dr. Alexander Langmuir of Harvard University Medical School and the National Cancer Institute's Maneker, who along with Hilliman held a driving desire to develop a vaccine for cancer. Hilliman initially stated that new viral vaccine combinations were being prepared for mass immunization campaigns based on studies of soldiers and prisoners, and that we have measles, mumps, rubella vaccines in various combinations that are up for licensing right now, to which Dr. Langmuir replied, I am very much in favor of a good vaccine. I hope they can be licensed, but before the product can be promoted for general use in 200 million people, there needs to be reasonably consistent and solid evidence that it not only produces antibodies, but protects. I insist that this has not been delivered. It is not a question of whether the product protects troops in a military camp or inmates of a certain institution. It should protect the high-risk group, the aged, and the chronically ill. Studies have been made, and some have shown rather good results, but they are anything but consistent. It seems to me that we cannot yet say we have a product that should be promoted for general use. Furthermore, let us not go adding a lot of things to vaccines that themselves are still questionable, squalene, and hope to give them a little extra aura of authenticity. Here Langmuir objected to the inconsistent efficacy of some vaccines that, when combined with other vaccines, might reduce even more the overall benefit or even produce harm. One example of the less than ideal results achieved from a mass immunization campaign is shown in Figure 14.3. Graph shows measles incidence rates per 100,000 population 12 months prior to the mass campaign and 16 months after the mass campaign in West and Central Africa. Data shows a return to pre-campaign disease levels by month 15 in Cameroon, Chad, Gabon, the Gambia, Ghana, Guyana, Nigeria, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Togo. Source William H. Foge, Center of Disease Control, reprinted from measles vaccination in Africa, presented during the Pan American World Health Organization International Conference on the Application of Vaccines Against Viral, Rickettsial, and Bacterial Diseases of Man, December 14th through 18th, 1970, page 210. More incredibly, Rasmussen added his concern that a slow virus immune system destroying disease, essentially identical to AIDS, would be a likely outcome of multiple mass vaccination programs due to the way viruses reproduce by altering their host's immune system. In view of the complexity and diversity of immunizing antigens and the possible host responses, an occasional adverse interaction should not surprise us. Such proved, widely used vaccines as pertussis and BCG are known to increase and modify immunological reactivity profoundly. A number of viral immunogens, notably measles, consists of or are prepared from viruses. There must also be biological interactions, genetic among sufficiently closely related viruses, and those sharing a virus-coded mechanisms for the synthesis of subunits, viral components, and new viruses. The dangers confronting us in the development and use of new vaccines, together with those known to exist with the present vaccines, may have been overemphasized, but they are very real. Like Strecker, Rasmussen went on to cite the sheep Visna virus as an example of the risk of creating slow, progressive immune system and nervous system destroying epidemics. He explained, among the dangers, the possible potentiation or activation of certain slowly progressive viral infections is particularly difficult to combat, because untoward reactions may be so few or so distantly related to the initiating immunizing procedure as to be overlooked unless rigorous and sustained surveillance is undertaken, and, even if recognized, may not become clearly evident until large numbers of people have been placed at irreversible risk. If we are to anticipate unknown dangers, it is imperative that all facets of the immune response and other responses to any new product be exhaustively studied. Furthermore, Rasmussen even warned that vaccines may actually potentiate the cell-killing properties of some RNA viruses, and that bizarre, unpredictable nervous system disorders and lymph cancers like those associated with AIDS might be expected from this research. Maneker then replied largely in agreement with Rasmussen's concerns, but quickly steered the focus of their discussion away from the controversy and toward the control of cancer with vaccine, explaining his work at the National Institute of Health and that of his colleagues at the National Cancer Institute. The cancer virus expert presented some of the challenges they faced with selective defining of populations or groups at higher risk through blood collection and analysis programs, preventing liability and evading accountability. Next, conference participants discussed their legal financial concerns in the event their vaccines caused illness, disability, and death. Dr. Dull from the CDC directed discussion on the question of indemnification or liability protection, fancy word for that, indemnification of persons unforeseeably or unavoidably injured by immunization or other processes in preventative medicine. He noted his concern over court awards of large money settlements and the fear that the makers may not only discontinue the production of vaccines, but also turn their attention from research and development, on which we rely a good deal for advancement in this field. Moreover, he offered a way out through legislative mechanisms, he argued. As many of us recognize, the current attitudes have resulted from the fact that we are now much better able to interpret the risks and benefits of immunization than formerly, and that we also have a population increasingly desirous of sharing in health decisions and unwilling to assume the risks of injury from the unknown and unavoidable aspects of preventative medicine. The law, speaking for the consumer, or in this case the patient, looks commonly to the deepest pocket, which is often the producers or the insurance companies, for compensation for injuries possibly related to immunization. If we acknowledge that the benefits of immunization accrue not only to the recipients of vaccines but also to the community, as well as to the producers, it is quite reasonable for us to seek administrative or legislative mechanisms that will spread the cost of unavoidable injuries to all who benefit and will attempt to educate patients so as to enable them to balance their own minds some of the risks and benefits. Could this possibly be the laying of the foundation for the vaccine compensation courts? Such mechanisms could prevent the discrediting of the practices of immunization and preventative medicine, the costly litigation of personal injury claims, and the suppression of the imaginative development of new vaccines, drugs, or other preventative medical procedures. At the same time, they could increase the public's confidence in acknowledging risks and benefits, reporting adverse reactions, and thus extending our knowledge of the field of preventative medicine. Many other countries are far ahead of us in these areas. Some in Western Europe and in the Far East already have legislation to this effect are developing it. Perhaps some of the participants from those countries would like to comment. Dr. von Magnus from the Statens Serum Institute in Denmark responded, "Some years ago in Denmark, a number of cases of polio-like disease occurred that were related in time to the oral polio vaccine campaign and were considered compatible with a diagnosis of vaccine-induced polio. Since the vaccine had been given to a large segment of the population, about 2.7 million doses, within a very short time, these cases were very conspicuous. Claims were made for compensation for the damage considered to have been caused by the vaccine. The Minister of the Interior, who is the man responsible for our health services, immediately promised indemnification or liability protection for the damage if it was caused by the vaccine. An expert committee set up for the purpose decided that some 6 to 8 of the cases were actually compatible with such a conclusion, and financial compensation was awarded to the incapacity suffered. Since then, the whole problem of vaccine-induced incapacity has been raised, particularly with respect to smallpox and pertussis vaccination. A committee has been set up to consider this problem and is at present working on it. Up to now, over a period of about 10 years, we had received about 20 claims for indemnification, mostly from parents of children who had received pertussis vaccination, and also 2 or 3 cases of encephalitis following smallpox vaccination. Brain swelling. The general plan is to prepare legislation under which the government must take care of these people and pay them financial compensation for their disability in accordance with their reduced earning capacity if it is considered due to the vaccination. This will be handled in much the same way as workmen's compensation. The current idea is that these payments will be made only to people who have become incapacitated from vaccinations that are recommended or required. I believe that the recommendation will be to create a law whereby those who suffer lasting incapacity from vaccination will receive financial support from the state in the form of an annual pension somewhat higher than is available to persons suffering handicaps caused by other factors. Thus, vaccine manufacturers were freed from accountability and liability. Instead, taxpayers shouldered the burden once again. Whatever happened to the Hippocratic Oath? Above all, do no harm. I wondered. Oh, we all wonder, don't we? Don't we all wonder? Immunization procedures and propaganda. Another revealing soliloquy came from Dr. James Gear, director of the South African Institute for Medical Research's Vaccine Studies in Johannesburg. Describing the broad extent of South African vaccination and propaganda programs, a paternal spirit may also be recognized in his comments. South Africa produces or has the facilities to produce nearly all the vaccines required for its own use and helps to meet the needs for the neighboring territories and islands. Vaccines for protection against poliomyelitis, smallpox, diphtheria, whooping cough, and tinnitus are available and free to all. Vaccines against measles, yellow fever, and cholera are available to all in special need of them. Some local authorities, such as the City Council of Johannesburg, have decided to offer rubella vaccines to all schoolgirls above the age of 10 years. Several vaccines, such as those against herpes virus, specifically the range in cancer research at the time, varicella and cytomegalovirus, trachoma, and bilharzia, are under investigation. Extensive serological surveys have been carried out and are being continued to determine the immunity of different age groups of the population to the enteroviruses and respiratory viruses, including measles and rubella and the arbovirus infections among Merck's prime research areas. The findings are of value in determining their needs for vaccine. The jet gun has been extensively used in this campaign and is a most valuable time-saving weapon, but it has to be handled by someone expert in its use. It was our experience that it was essential to launch a propaganda campaign to convince parents of the value and the need for vaccinating their children and also of the dangers of neglecting to have them vaccinated. The most effective means was found to be the radio. It seems that every family in southern Africa has at least one transistor radio. Jet guns, mosquitoes, and marginal advantages. Jet guns, according to Dr. Paul Worley of the University of Southern California School of Medicine, were developed for the efficient population coverage and were largely credited for the apparent success of the smallpox program. The jet guns, Worley explained, make for efficient administration of vaccines requiring paternal inoculations of large volume. For example, diphtheria, tinnitus, and typhoid, and for immunization programs conducted in more concentrated populations such as the larger villages and cities. The device, manufactured in different sizes to accommodate various age groups, is comparatively expensive, and breakage and maintenance problems are certain to occur unless operators are carefully selected and trained. The chief of arbovirus diseases including yellow fever for the World Health Organization, further explained the way jet gun programs were administered by USAID teams during the smallpox measles program. The basic problem, Dr. Bress explained, was that viral research, initiated in Uganda in 1936 by the Rockefeller Foundation and continued by the Eastern African Virus Research Institute of the Eastern African Community, was unable to keep up with the flight path of Aedes aegypti, a mosquito that Bress stated was the classic vector of urban yellow fever. He noted, however, since it breeds far away from human dwellings in East Africa, A. aegypti only rarely bites man. Monkeys, he explained, were believed to be the likeliest vector species, despite his acknowledgement that mosquitoes more often than monkeys bit humans. Bress also reviewed the epidemics in the past decade and noted that yellow fever has broken out several times between 1958 and 1966 in 8 Central West African countries. 230 cases with 216 deaths were recorded during this period, where 2,000 to 20,000 cases were suspected. As a result, the World Health Organization yellow fever expert reported nearly 2 million vaccinations were carried out in a period of 2 months on the 3 million inhabitants of Senegal. A total of 125,000 doses of the 17D, the yellow fever vaccine, were available at that time to vaccinate nearly 1 million children under 10 years of age. The use of FNV vaccine instead of 17D in many children in this age group was followed by 240 complications with 25 fatal cases of encephalitis. Petojet injectors were on trial for the first time in an African epidemic and were judged to be very efficient. Another example Bress gave was the Ghana Upper Volta and Nigerian outbreak of 1969. Here he reported 5 cases in Ghana, with 2 deaths and possibly 250 other jaundice patients, of which 73 died. The cause of death as yellow fever, however, could not be confirmed. Moreover, on the opposite side of the common border, 87 confirmed cases with 44 deaths occurred in Upper Volta, but the authorities estimated as many as 3,000 unconfirmed cases with 100 deaths occurred. As in Senegal, Bress admitted the country had previously been vaccinated and 90% of the victims were young children. And now they say, we've approved the vaccine to be eligible for 5-year-olds now. Yes, that's so good. How much more we got? Not much. The urban type epidemic, he believed, was easily controlled by vaccinating 600,000 people with 17D carried out by well-trained teams of United States for Assistance of International Development. Although during these 1969 epidemics, Bress explained 4 million doses of 17D vaccine were administered, including 1 million supplied by the WHO, or World Health Organization. Most were administered with Petojet injectors by United States Assistance for International Development teams. In conclusion, he reported, it is quite easy to protect an individual using 17D vaccine, but difficulties arise if we aim at the protection of a whole country. Eradication of A. aegypti is impossible in Africa because the mosquito breeds in the brush as well as in the towns. Eradication of other possible vectors is equally impossible. Max vaccination, therefore, appears the most effective method of countrywide protection. Such programs are a question of speed. Several teams are necessary. One team can perform 500 to 1,000 vaccinations an hour. As the vaccine requirements may be considerable in a short time, World Health Organization has constituted a reverse of 2 million doses of the 17D. Several conference delegates thought it interesting that so much vaccine was being administered in an effort to save so few lives. Arguably, even a single life is precious, but the fear that fatal vaccine reactions were being underreported by the same tenfold factor that cases were. And still today, the vaccine adverse event recording system, you can maybe at the most 10% is recorded. And even in that 10% being recorded, it pales in comparison from the last 33 years combined of everybody harmed by vaccines. Within those 33 years combined, more people have been harmed by these new mRNA vaccines within a year. I guess it'll be the next book in probably 10 years. Okay, where were we? Finally, the knowledge that the New York City-based Rockefeller Foundation's earliest investments in viral research occurred in Uganda, bordering eastern Zaire, I noted as potentially relevant. Could Rockefeller funding have been behind the Health Research Council of the City of New York, I wondered, gaining public acceptance? Radio advertising was not the only method needed and used to persuade families to accept Western vaccination recommendations. Dr. Carl Taylor from Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health advanced a complete campaign designed to overcome the cultural blocks influencing an acceptance of immunization programs in developing countries. Some of Taylor's recommendations reviewed standard World Health Organization policies regarding propaganda and vaccination teams. The WHO's Epidemiological Research Laboratory, headed by Dr. T.M. Pollock, had in 1966 advised the propaganda team should be headed by the chief health educator who will distribute the work. The work of the team is arranged in such a way as to ensure the full cooperation of the public with the vaccination team. The vaccination team consists of 4 members: its leader organizer, a physician, the registrar, a clerk, the physician vaccinator, and the assistant. And in response to concerns that mass vaccination campaigns may be more risky and costly than they're worth, Dr. Abram Benson from the University of Kentucky chastised the congregation. We developed and published statistics of the high rate of vaccination complications, but the vast bulk of these complications are entities that have no prognostic significance whatsoever. Part of this discussion has borne on the fact that successful immunological control of a disease is based on acceptance by the public and by the medical profession. But from our debates on what is best or what is wrong, we are conditioning the public to reject measures that sometimes, in some situations, are very important. In warning against open communications regarding the risks of vaccination, Benson said, "We can indeed argue today whether the hazards equal or outweigh the value of vaccination in the United Kingdom or the United States. But as we argue these things, we impress those in less developed countries that there is a great danger here, and I am concerned whether we are not doing the total program a disservice." Racism and immunization for national security. Oh yeah, national security, right? We won't lock up pedophiles because of reason of national security. Moreover, Dr. J.R. Millard from the CDC explained the gravest dangers posed by a lack of public acceptance of mass immunization programs was the threat posed to whites by Spanish American Negroes. This, he said, was the greatest motive for supporting mass vaccination campaigns at home and abroad. Millard had worked closely with Dr. Foge at the CDC. Together, they administered extensive smallpox and measles vaccination campaigns in Western and Central Africa shortly after Hilleman's group at Merck standardized the mass application of combined live measles smallpox vaccines on the same continent. Miller drew the group's attention to excerpts from the 1970 issues of Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. The first heralded a marked resurgence of measles cases in 1969. Of the 261 cases, 255 were Negroes, which he said showed the development of new populations of susceptibles in the younger age group who have not been immunized. The second excerpt reported 96 cases of tonsillar or pharyngeal diphtheria in San Antonio through September 6, 1970. He read, "The outbreak is centered in lower socioeconomic areas of the city and in a few census tracts. The highest attack rates have been in the 5 through 9 and 10 through 14 year age groups. Of the 80 patients whose immunization status was known, 43, 54%, had no previous immunization against diphtheria, 23, 29%, had lapsed for inadequate immunization, and 14, 8%, were reported fully immunized." The table Millar presented depicted that attack rates among Spanish Americans and Negroes 10 times higher than those reported in the rest of the population. Immunizable diseases such as diphtheria and poliomyelitis, Millar said, had also increased substantially in 1970, as had measles among unvaccinated preschool children residing in poverty areas of major cities. "It is apparent," he said, "that the immunizable diseases are more and more restricted to the disadvantaged peoples in our nation, and that the incidence of immunizable disease among these groups is increasing." Millard then argued that the central issue and greatest risk to public health was one of race, class, and the crucial group, he said. It is apparent that race, residence, and riches are factors affecting immunization status. Being non-white, residing in the central city, and being poor all work against immunization practices. Activities to maintain high levels of immunization in the population have failed most dramatically among the urban poor, who are predominantly non-white. This medically disadvantaged group, variously described the hardcore to hard to reach, is at least 2 decades old. Reaching them is the fundamental problem that must be solved to control communicable diseases in developed countries. Millar's motives, it seems, were not singularly humanitarian. Some were coldly utilitarian, designed to protect the interests of the whites in both the United States and Africa. Immunization programs, according to Millard, served above all to protect the middle-class suburbanite, who, in light of his earlier remarks, was not at higher risk for these diseases. And is that why the vaccination campaign was coming out of South Africa? The problem, maintained Dr. Millard, was the threat posed by the transmission of diseases from non-white minority populations to Anglo-American children and families. The resurgence of disease in 1969 and 1970, as Nixon, Kissinger, and Rockefeller began restructuring government to facilitate an international alignment of power, Millard said, was caused by an accumulation of susceptibles for which additional immunization services were needed. Before closing, he referred to the U.S. Vaccination Assistance Act of 1962, the year I later learned the National Cancer Institute and Littleton Bionetics began intense cancer virus vaccine studies. The legislation had encouraged partially successful community-wide immunization activities across the nation. Reaching the non-white susceptibles, he concluded, was vital in preventing a resurgence of diseases, including polio, diphtheria, whooping cough, tetanus, and measles. This, he concluded, is the fundamental problem that must be solved to control communicable diseases in developed countries. In the United States, the central cities will continue to seethe with immunizable disease and thereby create a significant risk to other parts of the society until these people are regularly included in immunization practice. It's kind of opposite now. Now they're murdering people with the vaccines. Well, they always have. What am I talking about? Part 3. Covert operations. We will begin tomorrow. Chapter 15. The CIA Dietrich operation. Until next time.